Well, I'll do like I do usually in classrooms, which is do a rolling start. So the advertised subject for tonight is this guy, but I never really did get to the advertised subject of last week about the Constitution, which, so we'll do a little of that to start tonight, but because I like to start with a highlight reel, I'll give you this 20 seconds as sort of one of my favorites from Reagan. This is from 1982. Press conference.
I found out that I never get in trouble if I don't answer one of those. Sam?
Mr. President, talking about the continuing recession tonight, you have blamed the mistakes of the past, and you blame the Congress. Does any of the blame belong to you?
Yes, because for many years I was a Democrat.
Those of you old enough to remember Sam Donaldson, he's, kind of seemed like an unpleasant guy. That was him playing an act on the news. That's just what he did. It turns out I got to know him a little bit when I was working on my Reagan book. And he's actually a really wonderful guy in the ordinary sense. I'd run him at the hardware store in McLean, always with his toupee in place, because a guy like that can't be out without his toupee in place. But he's really a very nice guy. And he told me that was his greatest humiliation at Reagan's hands, was that answer. Because, we always yell at Reagan going to the helicopter and whatnot. And I'll show you a couple more when we get on to Reagan in a couple of minutes. Now, look, I do want to say a couple things about the Constitution, but only a couple things. I mean, doing the course for a whole year here still didn't cover a lot of really important, essential things because it's such a massive topic. So I can't really even do it in an hour and a half here tonight, but I think we can do something in about 10 minutes, which clears away a lot of the difficulty. So somebody asked, I don't know if you're here again tonight, last week about the idea of an Article 5 convention. This is the one where, if enough states call for a convention, Congress then has to call for one. And I guess I think I like the idea. It's never been done. Doesn't mean it can't be. It's there in black and white in the Constitution. It's never been done. And I'm kind of for it, but not for the reasons most people are. And I actually think there's a lot to be worried about it. I think it actually wouldn't work and probably wouldn't actually solve our problems. But one of the things to remember, it's something I ask students about. Is, the original Articles of Confederation, if you studied this in high school or college, remember it said that you had to have unanimous agreement of all 13 states to amend the Articles of Confederation. So the Annapolis Conference called for the convention in Philadelphia. They meet to revise the Articles of Confederation, and what's the first thing they do? They take the Articles of Confederation and throw them in the trash can and start over. Okay, fine. But then, when they march out 3 months later with this, it says, this shall take effect as soon as 9 states ratify it, not the unanimous 13. So the question I pose for students, and it's always a fun one because it really gets to the heart of some of the difficulties, is did the convention act illegally in ignoring the procedure, not sticking to their mandate, and prescribing a ratification process that didn't conform to the previous Constitution? Now, of course, Congress could, in its a resolution calling for a convention of the states today, put in language restricting it to a balanced budget amendment or a tax limitation amendment or 2 or 3 other things that are on people's minds. But what's to stop this convention of the states from doing what the one in Philadelphia did in 1787? And if you're a conservative, liberals want to amend the Constitution a lot more than conservatives do. They'd be a lot more eager to do it. Now, of course, it's true as a practical matter that 3/4 of the states aren't going to go along with amendments that are bad, probably, but who knows? The answer, by the way, is, and I think it's Federalist 43. I should have brought my Federalist papers with me. Madison gives the answer to that question, by the way, in Federalist 40 and 43, I think. And in fact, it's in 43, which is, I think, the central paper, the middle of the Federalist Papers, is the only indirect but clear reference to the Declaration of Independence that you'll find in the Federalist Papers. But anyway, that we can come back to that in a minute, because I think what I will say sort of puts this in perspective. So there's our little Constitution, right? You can put it in your pocket, carry it around. Hugo Black was always famous for having his tattered copy of the Constitution. By contrast, this is the Constitution of Europe. It's 400 and, this is, by the way, printed on both sides of the page here. 400 and some odd pages. This is about 5,000 words, 4,700 words. This is about 50,000 words. And one of the things I can't tell you is I can't even tell you if that's actually in force. I mean, it was supposed to be ratified by all the European Union members unanimously. And then you kept having Belgium and Portugal vote in referendums against it, and Ireland. This is 10, 12 years ago now or more. And so they said, fine, we won't make it a constitution. We'll make it a treaty. But of course, if it's it's the Lisbon Treaty now, and I think they fiddled with it some. So I don't know what exactly legal force it has. It's a very confusing matter. Because actually, the Constitution of Europe, when you strip away all of the barnacles on it, which are most of it, it turns out to be the Articles of Confederation. A weak central government without an executive, sort of, but you have this European Parliament and the Brussels Commission. It's all very confusing. So I always like to ask students, so what's the difference between that and this? I mean, the obvious one is this is really short. And it's not simple to understand all of it, but you can't understand that at all. It's impossible. I'd like to draw people's attention to one of the most famous passages from John Marshall in the McCulloch versus Maryland case. This is a passage that ends with a sentence that has generated lots of mischief over the years. But I think it begins to tell you what the difference is here and how you need to think about this very clearly. A constitution to contain an accurate detail of all the subdivisions of which its great powers will admit, and of all the means by which they may be carried into execution, would partake of the prolixity of a legal code, and could scarcely be embraced by the human mind. It would probably never be understood by the public, like that. Bet you can't find one person, 50,000 in Europe, who could begin to explain what's in this thing and how it works, right? The prolixity of a legal code. So right away you see a hint that although this is a legal document, but it's also something else. It's more than just a legal document. I'll suggest a couple of ways in a minute why thinking of this strictly as a legal document, the way we tend to throw it upon our judges, is to commit an error. Anyway, to continue with Marshall. Its nature, therefore, requires that only its great outlines should be marked, its important objects designated, and the minor ingredients which compose those objects be deduced from the nature of the objects themselves. That this idea was entertained by the framers of the American Constitution is not only to be inferred from the nature of the instrument, but from the language. Why else were some of the limitations found in the 9th section of the first article introduced? It is also in some degree warranted by their having omitted to use any restrictive term which might prevent its receiving a fair and just interpretation. There he's referring to things like the necessary and proper clause in Article 1, Section 9, as well as some of the specific limitations of Article 1, Section, I think, is necessary and proper, is that Section 9 or Section 8? I can't remember. It doesn't matter. The necessary and proper clause says all these previous enumerated powers of Article 1, Section 8, Congress shall have the means, all things, necessary and proper means to bring those into effect. And that's become a great, expansion clause, right? Everything becomes necessary and proper to something else. That and the general welfare clause. So Marshall is saying there needs to be some play in the joints here, but connected to the nature of the objects themselves. Say more about that in a moment. But the last sentence, this was quoted a number of times by the Warren Court in its activist phase in the late 50s. In considering this question, then, we must never forget that it is a constitution we are expounding. I say liberals were fond of that last sentence in McCulloch, and I always like to say, actually I borrowed this from Alex Bickel, famous professor at Yale Law a million years ago, who used to say, what if we change that last sentence to read just differently? We must never forget that it is a blank check we are expounding. No, we wouldn't go for that, would we, right? But many parts of the Constitution, the modern Constitution, or the interpretation of it have become something close to a blank check. Certainly the Commerce Clause, which now justifies about anything, almost anything. The court has found a few limits to the Commerce Clause, finally. Or as Joe Sobran once remarked, too bad for poor Stalin. Just imagine what Stalin could have done if only he'd had a Commerce Clause. So one question I like to ask to start out with students considering this for a whole year is, why do we write it down in the first place? I mean, the British don't have a written constitution. Talked about that a little bit last week. And what are we to make of some of the puzzles in it and some of the terms that obviously lend themselves to a variety of legitimate interpretations? with implications for how government power is used. I like to show people some of Madison's notes from the convention in Philadelphia. You know, he's taking notes day by day of what was said, including by himself. And here and there are some really interesting and curious hints that we skip over today, if we read those notes at all. We skip over today and don't notice their importance, I think. One of them is, you know, one of the limitations that is placed explicitly in Article 1 is that, let's see if I find it here. Yeah, it's in Section 9. No bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed. Bill of attainder is a law that says, I'm going to take Professor Lowenstein and send him to jail just because. It's a bill of attainder, right? Ex post facto law, of course, means a law passed after the fact. If tomorrow the legislature of Colorado passes a statute that says anyone who has crossed the street on a green light has now violated the law, and we're going to go back to our traffic cams and arrest everybody who did that. That would be an ex post facto law. Although, curiously, an early court decision said that only applied to criminal law and not to civil law, and that's a very complicated question. But when that language came up at the convention, because, you know, the way the Constitution was written is they'd argue about it a bunch, and then they'd do resolutions. The Committee on Style would come back with the proposed language to go in here. And when that sentence came back, there was an interesting argument that went on for a few minutes. With, I forget who, no, it was James Wilson of New Jersey, that's who it was, who said, why do we need to have a mention of an ex post facto clause in here? Everyone knows an ex post facto law is an illegitimate law, and as it would be unconstitutional. We don't need to write that down. And he goes on to say, I think the language is something like this: if we include that clause, people will think we are ignorant of the first principles of justice. In other words, if we translate that as, people will think we're idiots if we put that clause in here. Something obvious like, you know, we don't need to list that the sun rises in the east, right? A similar thing came up during the debate over the Bill of Rights in 1789 in the first Congress, which is why we got the Ninth Amendment, the one that talks about unenumerated rights, because I think it was Theodore Sedgwick who said, echoing something Alexander Hamilton said, by the way, that if we start listing rights, if we leave anything out of the list, someday some idiots are going to think that because we left it out, it's something that the government can invade and regulate. So he said, I like this one, there's no amendment saying I have a right to wear a hat. He's trying to draw us back to the logic of, the fundamental logic of liberty itself. And this is something that Hamilton warned about, is that, you know, if we start writing down lists of rights, if we leave anything out, the presumption will slowly grow, and the people that, because it's not listed there in black and white, that I guess the government can go regulate it or pass laws about it. You know, it doesn't say in the Constitution we can't pass a law taxing dwarves, right? And that's kind of the way people are today. You will hear people say things like, my right to free speech as it is guaranteed or originates in the First Amendment. It's not the way the founders thought about it, right? It was a fundamental right. And, you know, Patrick Henry, who really wasn't satisfied even with the Bill of Rights, kept saying, well, just keep going and list everything we can think of. What's the matter? We think we're going to run out of paper? That was kind of his argument. As I say, it takes a while to marinate in the logic of all this. Federalist 78, which is Hamilton writing, he talks about, I'm not going to read the whole page, it goes on a long time, that's the way those guys wrote, like long sentences, but he talks about how it's often the case that we'll have two conflicting statutes passed by a legislative body. And the rule that we have for the courts is that when they can't be harmonized in some way, that the latter statute, the one most recently passed, supersedes the earlier statute. Because that is thought to represent, as in matters of positive law, the current sentiment of the political community, right? But here, I'll quote some of his language here. But this is a mere rule of construction, not derived from any positive law, but from the nature and reason of the thing. That might, you heard that language already in another form from Marshall in the McCulloch case. The nature of the objects themselves, the nature and reason of the thing. I mean, why would that be in the nature and reason of the thing? If you didn't, if you allowed courts to pick and choose which statute they like best, you would create a lot of instability in the law. And you'd also be thwarting the majority will of the legislative branch if you did it that way. Just because, I mean, these days, all legislatures and Congress hire a squad of lawyers who, when you propose a law, go back and look at existing statutes to see what existing laws it might conflict with, and then it becomes part of the new law to repeal those older laws. But sometimes you miss stuff. That still happens today. It happened a lot 200 years ago when you didn't have large legislative councils for legislative bodies. Yeah, so if you didn't have that rule, obviously you'd have some instability in the law. Okay, I already said that. But then he goes on to say, but of course we have exactly the opposite rule when it comes to the Constitution, right? If a statute, no matter passed by no matter how large a majority, is found to be in conflict with the Constitution, the court will rule that it's an illegitimate law, right? I'm trying to find the exact passage where he says that in 78. Yeah. Here's his actual language. But in regard to the interfering acts of a superior and subordinate authority. See, the Constitution is superior authority. But eventually we have to ask the question, why? And be able to answer that question convincingly and compellingly. But in regard to the interfering acts of a superior and subordinate authority, of an original and derivative power, and here's this phrase again, the nature and reason of the thing indicate the converse of that rule as proper to be followed. They teach us that the prior act of a superior ought to be preferred to the subsequent act of an inferior and subordinate authority, and that accordingly, whenever a particular statute contravenes the Constitution, it will be the duty of the judicial tribunals to adhere to the latter and disregard the former. And there's more of that. I often spend a lot of time looking at another overlooked Federalist paper. It's number 31, which is a paper about taxation where Hamilton strikes off this little disquisition about the nature of the moral law that's, I think, quite useful. Now, let me pop this back up for a second here. Conservatives, therefore, you've all heard, are originalists. Right? We're all originalists. And I'll tell you what, let's just get it up here like that. It'll be bigger this way, won't it? And normally I don't like to throw a lot of text up on, I hate doing text. My view is power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely, which is why I only use sight gags, simple charts and graphs. And but because this is a complicated passage, and I'll read it aloud to you, but I wanted you to have it so you could take it in a little bit also at your leisure. And this is from a distinguished jurist. I'll take guesses in a minute. Let's see here. Yeah. No one, we presume, supposes that any change in public opinion or feeling in the civilized nations of Europe or in this country should induce the court to give to the words of the Constitution a more liberal construction in their favor than they were intended to bear when the instrument was framed and adopted. Such an argument would be altogether inadmissible in any tribunal called on to interpret it. If any of its provisions are deemed unjust, there is a mode prescribed in the instrument itself by which it may be amended. But while it remains unaltered, it must be construed now as it was understood at the time of its adoption. It is not only in the same words, but the same in meaning, and delegates the same powers to the government, and reserves and secures the same rights and privileges to the citizen. And so long as it continues in its present form, it speaks not only in the same words, but with the same meaning and intent with which it spoke when it came from the hands of its framers and was voted on and adopted by the people, etc. Any other rule of construction would abrogate the judicial character of this court and make it the mere reflex of the popular opinion or passion of the day. This court was not created by the Constitution for such purposes. Okay, sound like pretty good. You like that? Anyone want to guess which distinguished jurist said this, wrote this? Do you know, Mark?
Yes, Felix Frankfurter.
Nope. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you would. Actually, no, it doesn't surprise. This is kind of obscure because, here's a hint, it appears in what I still believe is the longest Supreme Court opinion ever done. What? Yeah, this is Chief Justice Taney in the Dred Scott opinion. Ah, fooled you, didn't I? Right? Fools everybody every time. What's that?
I've actually read that. That is a piece of work.
Yes, well, and yeah, it's long because all the dissents and everything else. And now, I mean, I won't go through the opinion now. I do this in class. Spend a couple days on it about even from this point of view, he has it wrong. He has misconstrued the original understanding of the Constitution for a couple of reasons I will suggest. But he makes some very specific mistakes, it seems to me, in discovering a federal right of property in slaves when, for the founders, the awful compromise was it was a state matter. I mean, that was Frederick Douglass's great view prior to this decision, is that you wouldn't have to change a word of the Constitution to get rid of slavery, because the states could do it. And there wasn't a federal right. Now, what you did have was the Fugitive Slave Clause. Remember the language there. It says persons held to service. Persons, first of all. Tawney was confused on that point, right? Another interesting moment in the convention, the Committee of Style came back with the Fugitive Slave Clause language, and they suggested the language read, persons legally held to service. And Madison stands up and says, I make the motion that we strike the word legally from the language. I mean, he understood you were going to have a clause like this as the political compromise to keep the southern states in the Union, without which you don't have a country. But he says, I feel it would be wrong to admit in the Constitution that there's any moral legitimacy to slavery. So we leave the word legally out of it. Oh, interesting little sidelight. And of course, this is lost on Tawney, along with lots of other things. The reason I bring this up is there's at least 4 or 5 kinds of conservative originalism. And actually, if you read Scalia and Thomas very closely, they're really quite different. And even though they often vote together, not always, but most often vote together, when they file concurring opinions, they're often reasoned quite differently. To put it in very brief terms, Scalia is very much a narrow textualist, especially with statutes, but also with the Constitution. And if he can't make out something clear in the text, like, for example, the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law. I always like to joke that the Libertarian Constitution, the Bill of Rights would have said, Congress shall make no law, period, full stop, let's go home. Right, that would, But the Fourth Amendment, I mentioned this the other day, people shall be free in their persons, places, and effects from unreasonable searches and seizures. Well, what is unreasonable, especially in changing technology, telephones, airplanes, wiretapping, all the rest of that, that's obviously not something that can be resolved just by reading the text alone. That calls for interpretations by judges and legislatures. They both have a role in all that. So the point is to draw you back again to that language in Marshall and Hamilton about the nature and reason of the thing itself. Finally, I think draws us back to what I think are the 4 most important parts of understanding a Constitution. One is to understand the natural rights and natural law theory behind it, which you find not so much in the Constitution, but I argue the Declaration of Independence, which is, most people tend not to ever read past the prologue. We hold these truths to be self-evident, right? All the fun stuff, the laws of nature, nature's God. Wait a minute. This says this has where is it here? Here it is. This is my Cato Institute copy, which they used to advertise as the Cato Institute no obligation copy of the Constitution they give you for free. Now, that's perfect libertarian, no obligation at all. The classical liberal theory of the culminating in the 18th century, and people like especially Locke, is all individuals are free and equal in certain faculties, although not every faculty, but they're free and equal in the sense that Lincoln zeroed in on. The right not to be governed without, and that Jefferson circled in on, the right not to be governed without your consent. And that's what's encapsulated in the first couple of paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence. And then these days we tend to skip over all the grievances with the king, and we miss a couple of things that I think are important. One is, And I put number 3 here, separation of powers, right? Turns out that maybe it's just a coincidence, because we always wonder about Jefferson, but God is mentioned 4 times in the Declaration of Independence. Once as creator, so, right, but then also as a legislator, the laws of nature and nature's God, right? God, the lawgiver. He's also just, referred to as the supreme judge of the world. At the end, right, we make our appeal to the supreme judge of the world. And then in the middle, he's the executive. I forget the exact language where God is mentioned as the executive. Funny how that corresponds with the Holy Trinity in Christianity, right? For a guy like Jefferson who may or may not have believed in the Holy Trinity, who knows? But then, let's see if I can find the right passage here. One of the first complaints against the king is he has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. Sometimes you'll hear people say, especially my hardcore libertarian friends, that the Declaration of Independence is a hardcore libertarian document. I said, well, to a certain extent I understand the theory of that, but here you see in several of these passages, like the next one, he has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodations of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature. So you see, he's talking about here that the government is interfering, the king is interfering with the rightful government and the rightful governing institutions. It's not an anarchistic document at all. It's amazing, and not just libertarians, a lot of liberal historians get this wrong too, because they just read it very superficially. And then there's a passage in here where, I have it in my notes, where he actually says the king has, yes, here it is. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution. Wait a minute, what Constitution is Jefferson talking about here? Because there isn't this yet. There isn't Articles of Confederation yet. He's talking about it very much in the English sense of the nature and reason of the thing in this case being the structure of modern representative government itself. So the point is, I've gone longer than I planned to. So the point here is, in a very general sense, is to really understand this document and make it work right, I argue, you need to understand its philosophical theory a lot more deeply than we do. Why we have the separation of powers. That, as I mentioned a couple weeks ago, has been under direct attack by leading progressives like Woodrow Wilson for 100 years, such that a lot of it is eroded these days, and that in turn has changed our institutional structure in a lot of ways, right? And that's why an Article, I'll put it this way, whether it's done by an Article 5 convention or whether you actually got the states to adopt a couple of amendments, like a balanced budget amendment, I think are gimmicks that wouldn't actually restore the document to the way it's supposed to work. If in the absence of understanding and recapturing its original understanding, its original philosophical understanding, right? I'll end with this one. The balanced budget amendment is an idea that's been around for a long time. In fact, that was the original idea in the 1970s for an Article 5 Constitution. And I think 33 states passed resolutions calling for a balanced budget convention, and then it stalled out. And then twice it came within a vote or two in Congress in the 80s, and then again once in the 1990s. And it's very unlikely, I think, that you would have an amendment adopted that didn't have some language in it creating exceptions for wartime or national emergency. To do anything else would be, I think, pretty irresponsible. On the other hand, if you had that kind of language, as Pat Moynihan used to say, I'm sure every year we would have this convenient arrangement with Iceland. They would declare war on us, and therefore we wouldn't have to balance the budget, and who could challenge that in court, right? Or be a little bit more serious. It's only in a couple extra words for Congress in 2001 to declare a state of national emergency for the purposes of the post-9/11 world. And in other words, it's easy to get around even pretty clear language if you want to, if you're determined, if your politicians are determined to do that. So Anyway, I'll stop with that. I thought we'd talk about Reagan for a while, who had constitutional views. But if somebody has a burning question about what I've just said, maybe I should take it now. Yeah.
You raise a good point, because even like the debt ceiling, that's now all that does is just raise the amount of debt that you raise the debt ceiling, and immediately the budget goes up to that level. And I think it's the same thing with a balanced budget. It really doesn't have any impact that you would hope it would have.
Well, and you wouldn't want to write in, I don't think you'd want to write in your Constitution super specific language about how budgets are, what's a budget? I mean, we have the federal budget, but all the off-budget stuff, would that be, how is that going to work? And you want judges deciding that? I think you probably don't, myself. I think that's a mistake on a whole bunch of levels. It's in other words, the problem, what I've really just said is the problem is actually much worse than people think, right? On that cheery note, yeah, right.
Before we leave this subject, you have a few comments about the present growing amount of activist judges who are playing around with these things right here, number one, and they are nullifying laws that have been created by states. And, of course, a lot of them are on appeal, but...
Well, the problem is I have a lot to say about all of that. And we only have another hour, and I want to do some other stuff.
Well, we can have another lecture.
Yeah, well, I'm going to try and talk, I think, Brad Berger into having me come back next May and actually do a whole real Maymester course that would be, every day for 3 weeks or however it works. Maybe I could do that. It could be fun. It's nice here in May, I've noticed. It stopped snowing by the middle of May. God. Let me make a general comment about that. We have for 60 years now and I talked about this in class actually, about the Brown decision, which we just observed the 60th anniversary of, right? Everyone pretty much agrees that it was the right outcome, and a 9-0 vote is interesting. On the other hand, I tell my students to read paragraph 4. Paragraph 4, Warren says, we can't figure out what the 14th Amendment means. We've gone back and tried to read what the big debates about it in Congress, about what it was going to do. And so we give up. I'm paraphrasing a bit, but I don't think that's an inaccurate paraphrase. So we give up on the 14th. We're just going to decide this case on other grounds. Now, it's written in sort of fairly sober language, and, because of the importance of the case, you kind of blow by that kind of fast until you realize what they just said is we're not going to ignore the Constitution and find some other reason to strike down segregation. Okay, fine, but that means the court has now said we're going to dispense with the Constitution now. And it's really an interesting thing that they didn't rely on the Equal Protection Clause directly in that case. But then a whole string of cases ever since then, that's just one area we can talk about, a whole series of cases since then, often in short per curiam opinions. That per curiam means an opinion of the court, not signed by or written by a particular justice, would strike down some segregating law or some racial discrimination law saying it violates the Equal Protection Clause. See Brown versus Board of Education. And they're referring to a decision that gave no explication of what the Equal Protection Clause is supposed to mean. And this, and from there it's been all downhill in a lot of areas, right? As I say, I could talk for weeks about that.
You probably could do the same on number 3, separation of powers, executive orders, as compared with part of the Declaration telling what the king was doing or not doing.
Well, now, one thing I didn't do at all tonight is talk about the broad problems of executive power. So, again, this is a good way to introduce these problems to students. Is who declares war? Congress. Who's the commander-in-chief? President. Guess what? That means they're going to go like this a lot. So there's a lot, and that's one place. There's constant invitations to struggle between the branches in here. So there's a lot of blended powers. A lot of the separation of powers is not neat and clear, and that's hard. And that requires, in other words, part of what I'm saying to restate it is, our constitutional literacy has fallen to a very low. Lawyers are wonderful technicians about the subject. There's this large body of case law you have to master if you're going to practice it in court. At the same time, from a point of view of a citizen or leaders in Congress, our constitutional literacy is really atrophied. Here, I will end with this. So, I think I've said this a few times. Nancy Pelosi got widely ridiculed when she was Speaker when she said about Obamacare, you'll have to pass the bill to find out what's in it. I thought that was the most intelligent thing she ever said. And that's because she was right. Because you don't actually pass laws anymore. You pass these big, thick mission statements saying the administrator or the secretary shall figure something out. And they write regulations that are like that, and that has the force of law. So they delegate lawmaking authority. So she wasn't wrong about that. But the other one that was interesting is when some reporter impertinently asked her, what's the constitutional authority for Obamacare? And her answer was, remember this, are you kidding? That was her answer. And that threw me back to 100 years ago to one of my favorite progressive Republicans was Albert J. Beveridge of Indiana. And he was an interesting guy. Not progressive like the ones today you attach that name to, but in a certain sense that's right. He gave one of the nominating speeches for Theodore Roosevelt at the 1912 Bull Moose Convention, and then returned to the Republican Party when Roosevelt came back after Roosevelt lost. But in 1907, I think it was 1907, he was pushing for a federal child labor bill. Now at that time, the Commerce Clause, you thought you could not reach child labor in the states. It was a matter only the states could reach. And he argued for 3 days on the floor of the Senate why a bill would be constitutional, a federal bill would be constitutional. And his arguments are really good. And here's a senator, right? Now he's a lawyer, it's true. But the fact that he could hold divorce for 3 days and make very persuasive arguments about the matter, which probably over time played out and played into the Supreme Court changing its mind in certain ways, contrasts very sharply with Pelosi. So my contrast is, 100 years ago, progressives could give you 3 days. Now Pelosi gives you 3 words. And that's where we are. But as I suggested, some conservatives have problems with this too, I think. But I can go through that and have at various times. Okay. Make that go away. Yeah, I guess I'll save it. So shift gears directly and talk about Ronaldus Magnus, as Rush Limbaugh calls him, for a minute, because it will connect back to our original theme from the first night 2 weeks ago about Churchill, about the theme of prudence as the central virtue of a statesman. And remember, I defined it as 2 parts, having an attachment to principle of some kind and a profound understanding of the circumstances. And hold on, I'm going to find my other notes. We're going to see, as we look just a little bit at the latest thinking on Reagan and the end of the Cold War, a real example of prudence in action, I argue. And I'm not sure how clearly I laid this out the first night, but either the idea of statesmanship or its central virtue, prudence, you can't teach it or understand it the way you understand a quadratic equation. It can't be reduced to sort of simple bullet points like that. But you can study examples of it, I think. And that's why I raised these two together. I want to show you one other video of Reagan telling his Russian jokes. Yeah, I'll do that first, actually, because it'll... I'm not sure if I'll forget in the middle here. Yeah, I'll give you a couple of these here. These are really fun. Hey, stop that. Dang it all. Oh, I know what happened here. I probably... Oh, did we lose my connection? Wouldn't you know it? Why? Let's see if that works. They're doing this. Aha, there we go. Okay. Yeah, okay.
I've been collecting stories that are told in the Soviet Union by their people among themselves, which reveal they've got a great sense of humor, but they've also got a very cynical attitude toward their system. And I told this, and then you'll have to hear it again. I told it in the car. I didn't tell this one to Gorbachev. You know, there's a 10-year delay in the Soviet Union of delivery of an automobile. And only 1 out of 7 families in the Soviet Union own automobiles. There's a 10-year wait. And you go through quite a process when you're ready to buy, and then you put up the money in advance. And this happened to a fellow, and this is their story that they tell, this joke. That this man, he laid down his money, and then the fellow, and who was in charge, said to him, okay, come back in 10 years and get your car. And he said, morning or afternoon? And the fellow behind the counter said, well, 10 years from now, what difference does it make? And he said, well, the plumber's coming in the morning. I just want to, oh, I can't resist. I'm supposed to put it right here. In view of the five things that I just said, I don't know whether you know it or not, but I have a new hobby. I am collecting stories that I can actually prove are told among the Russian people. They make them up themselves, they tell them between themselves, reveals they got a great sense of humor. And they've also got a little cynical attitude about things in their country. And one of these stories, the one I'm going to tell you, I told to General Secretary Gorbachev. And he laughed. The story was an American and a Russian arguing about their two countries. And the American said, look, in my country, I can walk into the Oval Office, I can pound the president's desk and say, Mr. President, I don't like the way you're running our country. And the Russian said, I can do that. The American said, you can? He says, yes. I can go to the Kremlin, to the General Secretary's office, pound his desk and say, Mr. General Secretary, I don't like the way President Reagan's running his country. You know, less than one family out of 7 in the Soviet Union owns an automobile. Most of the automobiles are driven by the bureaucrats. The government furnishes them, drivers and so forth. So an order went out one day to the police that anyone caught speeding, anyone, no matter who, gets a ticket. Well, Gorbachev came out of his country home, his dacha. He was late getting to the Kremlin. There was his limousine and driver waiting. He told the driver to get in the back seat. He'd drive it. Down the road he went. They passed 2 motorcycle cops. One took out after him. And pretty soon he's back with his buddy. And his buddy says, well, let's give him a ticket. And he said, no. Well, he said, why not? Oh, he said, they're too important. Well, he said, we're told to give anybody a ticket, no matter who it is. Oh, he said, no, this one was, I couldn't. Well, he said, who was it? He said, I couldn't recognize him. But his driver was Gorbachev. What I heard was about the man walking along the street at night, Moscow. Soviet soldier called to him to halt. He started to run. The soldier shot him. Another man said, why did you do that? Well, he said, curfew. Well, he said, it isn't curfew yet. He said, I know. He's a friend of mine. I know where he lives. He couldn't have made it. I heard one about a fellow who went to the KGB to report that he lost his parrot. And the KGB asked him why he was bothering men. Why didn't he just report it to the local police? Well, he answered, I just want you to know that I don't agree with a thing my parrot has to say. Which makes me think of the story. Everything makes me think of a story. About 3 dogs, an American dog, and a Polish dog, and a Russian dog. They were all having a visit, and the American dog was telling them about how things were in this country. He said, you know, you bark, and you have to bark long enough, and then somebody comes along and gives you some meat. And the Polish dog said, what's meat? The Russian dog says, what's bark?
Whoops. Is there one? Okay.
I have to interrupt right here and tell you that one of my visits, I won't name him, I don't want to embarrass him, but one of the heads of state that I met with on this visit, he gave me one while I was on the way. Told me the story about the 2 fellows in the Soviet Union who were walking down the street, and one of them says, have we really achieved full communism? Is this it? Is this now full communism? The other one said, oh, hell no, things are going to get a lot worse.
So you see, he was relentless this way in public speeches that the Soviets read. You know, they followed what everything all Western leaders said. So I want to hold this thought about, you know, how deliberate this was and what purpose it served. So, because we're back to serious for a moment. So, the Cold War now is really receding fast. I mean, I joke that the Berlin Wall is old enough to drink in a bar, right? I mean, 25 years ago now it went down, which is amazing. I mean, growing up, I never thought that was coming down. And it's now, starting, in historical terms, it's starting to be something that we're going to pick over forever, like the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, or the Crusades and the French Revolution and things of that kind, right? And we're seeing some of that already. There's a whole bunch of new books out this spring. This one by a State Department historian, The Triumph of Improvisation, that I reviewed in National Review a couple weeks ago. Pretty good book. Could be longer, I think, actually. And the puzzle is this. On the one hand, it had to be deeply puzzling to the Soviet Union in the 80s. On the one hand, you had this outspoken anti-communist, Reagan, who would say all these nasty things about the Soviet Union. It's the evil empire. I mean, here he's telling jokes, showing, I think, sort of tip my hand a little bit, that he wanted to convey that he didn't respect them in certain ways. I mean, he used to ask his Soviet experts, I don't understand this country. They can make all kinds of advanced weapons that threaten the destruction of the world, and they can't make cornflakes. That's sort of the way he put it, right? I mean, it's a totally dysfunctional economy. That's why I like telling those jokes, right? One of the ones he did tell Gorbachev, I don't have the tape of it, is the two guys are one of the long lines, they just went forever to buy stuff in the Soviet Union. The one guy says to the other, this is intolerable, I'm going to go shoot Gorbachev. And he's back 5 minutes later, and his buddy says, you're back so fast. He says, yeah, the line to shoot Gorbachev was even longer. And he told that joke to Gorbachev, so it wasn't just doing it in speeches. He would tell this to, a Soviet leader, which is amazing when you think about it, right? Even if you're telling it with a sort of smile the way he does, it's still an insult. I mean, he said Gorbachev laughed. It had to be through gritted teeth sometimes. And in fact, we know that it was in a few cases. And on the other hand, he was keen to make an arms deal and to reach a brokered peace. And he said, end the Cold War. Right, which nobody thought possible. One of the first things to understand about Reagan is how different he was from all other conservatives. Virtually all of them. If you take your realists, Nixon, Kissinger, and many of the so-called neoconservatives of the time, Norman Podhoretz, Irving Kristol, they all thought the Soviet Union was here for good. Henry Kissinger openly wrote that. The Soviet Union's going to be around for 100 years or longer, and we got to figure out how to get along with them. That's what détente was all about, or else we're going to blow up the world. Okay, that makes some sense. Reagan very early on was saying, how can this possibly last? This is unnatural. He used that word, by the way. It's unnatural, against the dictates of the human heart, he said in the mid-70s. And although he never thought that the Soviet Union would collapse as quickly as it did, there's been some revisionist history of this that I think is not correct. He and a number of people around him thought, and especially the deputy director of the CIA, a guy named Herbert Meyer. I tried to get him to come here to Boulder this spring to talk about it, and he couldn't get the schedule to work out. He wrote this long memo in the fall of 1983 called Why the World is So Dangerous, about 8 or 10 or maybe 12 single-spaced pages. But the first paragraph was, this memo's about why we're going to win the Cold War and what the dangers are along the way. He said he thought it'd be 20 or 30 years. He didn't think it'd be 10 years. But he thought that things were changing for all the reasons that Reagan perceived, which is this is essentially a fragile system. So I'll give you two quotes to set the scene. One's from our old friend Churchill again. I mean, because the question about Reagan is he looks inconsistent. People were saying that while he was president, and ever afterwards they've said that. And lo and behold, our friend Churchill wrote one of his great essays called Consistency in Politics. And here's the first paragraph of that essay. It's in Thoughts and Adventures, which I didn't bring tonight, but everyone should have that book. A statesman in contact with the moving current of events and anxious to keep the ship of state on an even keel and steer a steady course may lean all his weight now on one side and now on the other. His arguments in each case, when contrasted, can be shown to be not only very different in character, but contradictory in spirit and opposite in direction. Yet his object will throughout have remained the same. His resolves, his wishes, his outlook may have been unchanged. His methods may be verbally irreconcilable. We cannot call this inconsistency. In fact, it may be claimed to be the truest consistency. The only way a man can remain consistent amid changing circumstances is to change with them while preserving the same dominating purpose. And it's that last sentence is the important one, preserving the same dominating purpose. Reagan's purpose to the end of the Cold War, but the instrumental part of that was, to paraphrase Lincoln on slavery, was to put communism in the course of ultimate extinction. So part of his strategy was to call them names, nasty names like the Evil Empire, especially like his 1982 speech in London before the Houses of Parliament, where he said, he committed grand larceny of the old Leninist Marxist phrase. He said, it's communism that's now writing its final chapters and is going to end up on the ash heap of history. Remember, Marx it was capitalism would be on the ash heap of history. And now Reagan was using their own language against them. Really annoyed the hell out of them. And then a big arms buildup, because he said they can't possibly keep up with us. And if they're determined to have an arms race, we will beat them. And he told that to Gorbachev. He says, I don't want to stop the arms race, but if you insist on having one, we'll win it. In his first face-to-face meeting with Gorbachev, he says that to him. On the other hand, he's giving these very conciliatory speeches, and he's sending handwritten letters, first to Brezhnev, then to Brezhnev's two octogenarian, barely functioning successors, Andropov and Chernenko, saying, this is really stupid to have this kind of division that threatens to end the world. Why don't we just sit down together and solve this once and for all? And why would the ideology get in the way? So here's Reagan on the one hand attacking the ideology and then saying we shouldn't take this seriously. Had to be deeply confusing to the Soviet leaders. And it was disturbing to some of Reagan's own people. Add to that his own deep pacifism. This didn't come out till years afterwards. But the president, I'm sure still today, although circumstances are obviously much different, but in those days when you're on a hair trigger with the potential to destroy two countries and a lot more in 30 minutes, the president has his little code card he'd carry in his pocket, and you have the military aide carrying what they called the football. That was a little transmission device to send the nuclear codes out to say, launch something. Yeah, exactly. This is crazy. There's a dramatization of this in the exercise in, I think, is The Sum of All Fears, Tom Clancy movie adaptation. And it shows the president in the beginning going through a drill. And all presidents take that drill sometimes before they take office. It's usually a couple of days. And the reason is, if you get the phone call that some missiles have been launched, you want to know, well, how many? What are the targets? You want to know what the response options are. Nobody actually knows. This is all still deeply classified, but it's a whole bunch of them. Because you don't have time to spend thinking about how to respond and what counter-strike should we do and so forth. President and his top advisors are supposed to know, okay, if it's an attack on NATO, if it's an attack on our military bases, an attack on the missiles, they'd have pre-programmed responses. Reagan refused to take his briefing for 1.5 years. He just kept taking it off his schedule, because he found it so distasteful, to the point that it started worrying the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, as a practical matter, there were other people who, we presume this, and actually I know a little bit about it because I knew the guy who carried the football for Reagan. He's a congressman now from Minnesota, John Klein. There's other people, because the president might be out of place, he might be assassinated, right? There's all those contingencies. So other people can push the button, so to speak. But still, you want the president to know how to do this. And Reagan didn't for 1.5 years. He found it so distasteful. And there were a number of his aides later came to say they weren't sure if it actually came to it, he would have pushed the button, because his view was, what's the point? This is kind of crazy. He never would admit that publicly, of course, along with a number of other things that his critics would say, you want to do X and Y. And even though he was, the one in particular that comes to mind is a lot of Democrats was always after him about Nicaragua, says Reagan won't be happy till there are American Marines in Nicaragua. And Reagan had said from the earliest days, we're not ever going to send any American troops to Nicaragua. We'll support a guerrilla operation, and that was very controversial. But he wouldn't say that publicly, because you always want your enemy to wonder what you might do. That's just sound statecraft, right? He was very disciplined that way. And then on the other hand, you have Gorbachev on the other side. Interesting figure. So the other quote I use for understanding the two sides of this problem comes from a Polish philosopher named Leszek Kolakowski. Interesting guy. He wrote, if anybody's interested in this, he wrote what I think is the best treatment of Marxism. It's a 3-volume series called Main Currents of Marxism. And he was a Polish, he was a communist, but by the time he finished writing this, he was an anti-communist. And the 3rd volume especially really beats down on it in a really extraordinary way. In May of 1983, now 1983 is the worst year in the 80s. That's when we were actually closest to possibly having real blows. Kolakowski wrote this. We can imagine that the Soviet rulers, under the combined pressure of self-inflicted economic disasters and social tensions, will accept, however grudgingly, a genuine, verifiable international disarmament plan and concentrate their efforts on a large-scale economic recovery, which they cannot achieve without a number of social and political reforms. This is 1983, 2 years before Gorbachev arrives as General Secretary. This might conceivably usher in a process of gradual and non-explosive disintegration of the empire. Now, in 1983, this seemed very fanciful, right? But it does describe what was coming down the path. But he added this: such a path, though the most desirable, is fraught with dangers as well. Everybody knows the great risk all despotic regimes incur when they try, under duress, to grow milder. And that also is exactly what happens. Gorbachev, in one sentence, was a genuine liberal reformer, but he was a somewhat confused one. He understood the arms race was madness and needed to end. He understood that the Soviet bureaucracy was crazy and it was an inhibition to prosperity and economic growth. But he never did understand the idea of markets or property rights. And in fact, he thought the problems of socialism required more socialism. And that was part of his problem at home. He was a genuine liberal reformer, and at the time it was called glasnost or openness. He would call on the editors of magazines and journals and saying, we're not going to censor anything anymore. You write what you want. And they couldn't believe it. Some of them tested it pretty early on and, weren't arrested. And so that starts to unfold because you can't really have a one-party monopoly by law but then have genuine pluralism and, a liberal discourse, right? He didn't understand that very clearly. And it was never any part of his purpose to see the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He wanted to rescue it, right? But he was, it's interesting that, Reagan kept writing these, these octogenarian Soviet leaders, and they'd keep dying on him, as he put it. So he never could have a summit with any of them. Probably wouldn't have gotten very far with any of them. They really were the old school, and Gorbachev really was of a different generation and perceived the rottenness of the system. And some of the people around him, two guys in particular who were senior aides, understood that the Communist Party was the problem and needed to be destroyed. Well, they couldn't openly say that because that was obviously a big risk. But Gorbachev purged a lot of the ranks of the military. He fired a lot of the senior bureaucrats and then put in new ones who weren't any better, really, right? It's the old problem of, one factory makes left shoes, another factory makes right shoes, and it didn't match, this silly Soviet way of doing things. And let's see. Let's see what parts I should talk about here. So I've described a little bit of Reagan's strategy, which is an arms buildup and diplomatic and political initiatives criticizing the Soviet Union. Talked about human rights a lot. But then, as I say, he would also be very conciliatory. And you could see this in the transcripts of the summit meetings that came out years later. Interesting thing is the Russian transcripts are better than the U.S. State Department transcripts. They're more complete. Our State Department tend to keep shorter notes, and the Russians took more copious notes, so they're better to read, actually. And they've all been translated. And you actually find them online if you want to chase them down, and they're a lot of fun. And one of the interesting things that happens is the 1985 summit in Geneva, that's the first one they had, of 4. It was the first time that the U.S. and the Soviet Union had ever done simultaneous translation. In other words, you have the earpiece, and while someone's talking, you're getting it translated live while it's going. All previous summits up to that point, all the ones Nixon and Ford and Carter had done, and even Johnson in the 60s, and probably Eisenhower in 59 for that matter, but certainly the ones in the 70s, you would have after-the-fact translation. In other words, President Nixon would say something, recorded, and then a Russian translator, and then they'd tell Brezhnev what was just said. In those days, all the Soviet people came with these big, thick notebooks. And the next thing that would happen is they'd flip through the notebook to a tab, and then they would read an answer, a pre-planned answer to what they thought should be the right answer to what the Americans had said. And Obviously, that made negotiations pretty slow. The truth is that most of those summits in the 70s, the diplomatic staffs had worked out stuff ahead of time, and the actual meeting was mostly for show. So here you had simultaneous translation, and as Reagan's chief of staff, Don Reagan, put it, Reagan and Gorbachev went at it like two New York taxi drivers after a fender bender. And they weren't just arguing. I mean, Reagan liked to argue all the time. It wasn't just for a public matter. He would argue with Tip O'Neill in the Oval Office and whatnot. And he would argue about human rights and democracy. And Gorbachev was always leading with his chin. He'd say, I read in the New York Times that, this is probably familiar, women only make 66 cents on every dollar a man makes in America, and this is not going to impress Reagan, quoting from the New York Times editorial page, right? And then at the Reykjavik summit, one of the really funny moments is Gorbachev goes on a long complaint that, there's no reciprocity in our trade. We take lots of American movies and show them in our theaters, but you don't take any Soviet movies and show them in America. And Reagan was remarkably restrained. He's talking to a Hollywood guy, by the way. I mean, what an idiotic idea this is. Really? Do you think there's an audience? Reagan explains patiently that it's a private industry. I don't control them. They can show what they want. If you have, he did hint at what the problem was here. He says, if you have some good movies that our movie industry likes, they will show them. That was his very polite way of saying, you have to be kidding. Your movies are stupid. No one's going to want to see a Soviet movie, right? Probably not. It might be one or two that are sort of well done. But Gorbachev wouldn't let go of this. And Reagan keeps saying, but I don't control well, you should, And there's another interesting part right at the beginning of that summit. One part I left out is, talk about a long time, is that Reagan and the U.S., and with some cooperation from some of our European allies, half-heartedly, really did inflict some economic pain on the Soviet Union. And one of the ways was several parts of this, but part of it was talking the Middle East into increasing oil production. So the price of oil fell down to under $10 a barrel in 1985. It had been $35 in 1980. Soviet Union got something like half of their foreign earnings from oil sales. Sounds like Putin today, right? And at the beginning of the Reykjavik summit, which was all overtaken by this grand deal to get rid of all nuclear weapons in 10 years that fell apart over Reagan's refusal to give up missile defense, Reagan says, hey, you guys have a grain deal with us, but you haven't taken delivery of the wheat, and you haven't paid for it. You haven't paid for the wheat we shipped you last year. And Gorbachev says essentially, well, that's because we're broke. He didn't quite put it that way, but and he says that's because of the collapse of oil prices has depressed our revenue, and we don't have the money to pay for the wheat we've contracted for. And then Reagan says, well, it's hurt, a lot of parts of my country too. And if you remember that period, Oklahoma and Texas were devastated. That's what began the S&L crisis. If you remember, that really happens later, but that starts really in Texas with the collapse of the oil industry, the domestic oil industry. And Reagan says, it's hurt us too. And Gorbachev says, but we know who started this, he says, and whose interest it's in. That was Gorbachev's way of saying, I know what you've been up to. And he's essentially admitting that it's squeezing them very hard. And so on the one hand, why they would be, Reagan would be pushing him very hard on the defects of communist ideology, their fundamental wrongness on human rights, their mischievous behavior in Afghanistan and Central America and Southeast Asia, which always got Gorbachev really angry. But then Reagan always seemed to know when to let up and when to change tone and change direction. And at that first summit, he says, why don't we take a break? And they take a break. He says, why don't we go for a walk? And that's when Reagan and Gorbachev walk off alone down to the lakeside house, and they start exchanging papers and talking. And Reagan, who said, right after Gorbachev became premier and people said he's different, including Margaret Thatcher saying he's different, Reagan wrote in his diary, I'm too cynical to believe that. After he'd spent time with him, he changed his mind. And he came back and says, I think Margaret Thatcher's right. This guy is different. I think we can make some progress with him. And they would talk very warmly about, gosh, someday, 20 years from now, we'll be old men and we can look back on what we've achieved. They're saying that before they've actually achieved something, but they're sort of talking very sentimentally. And that's something that's hard to imagine Nixon doing very convincingly, right? Or, yeah, especially Nixon. So let's see. So there were no briefing books at those summits. They would argue about fundamental things, which usually didn't happen in previous summits. You sort of paw around stuff. There's one part I should mention from the Geneva summit. And some people, when they heard the story a couple of weeks later, thought, oh, that's just Reagan being goofy. But at one point, he's saying, repeating what he'd said earlier to other Soviet leaders in letters, you know, why are we letting ideology get in our way of doing something sensible? And then he says, you know, I could imagine that if the Earth were invaded by aliens from another galaxy, we would have no problem uniting to fight them off. And, you know, I think it was Colin Powell, who was used to some of these earlier style of summits, said, you can imagine the Soviets in the old days flipping through their briefing book trying to find out what's the right answer to cooperating with the capitalist imperialists in an alien invasion scenario, right? And, you know, Reagan's people really didn't want him to tell that story. Because Reagan, after he walks out the door, he says to Secretary Shultz, says, I really threw them with the alien thing, didn't I? Right? So, you know, this was not completely as wingy as people thought. And then 2 weeks later, Reagan, and you can tell he was ad-libbing because of the syntax of the sentences. At the end of a speech in Maryland, he mentions that story. And you could tell his White House people are going, oh no, he's going to tell the little green men story. No, that's what they called it, you know. So the point is, there's extraordinary art at work here. It really is impossible to tell, you know, without mind reading, and I'm not even sure that would work. It's impossible to tell what was I call it sometimes the flywheel in Reagan, that made him know when to press hard and on what, and when to back off, and when to be conciliatory, when to reach for a deal, and when to say that deal's not good enough. Part of it goes back to his skill as a labor negotiator in the 40s and 50s. He knew how to cut to do a bargain and win a bargain. You know, Tip O'Neill used to say, "I hate negotiating with Ronald Reagan because he always gets 80% of what he wants," and that's because this old guy was actually quite patient, right? So that's on the Reagan side. I think it is probably right that if he hadn't had Gorbachev to deal with, it probably wouldn't have worked. And yeah, I want to try to keep this a little bit of chronological order. I'll just mention the Berlin Wall briefly, because I said it, you know, it came down 25 years ago now in a fit of bureaucratic ineptitude, it turns out. That's a funny story all by itself. But now Reagan's tear down this wall speech in June of '87 is regarded as one of his most famous. And of course the backstory there is everybody tried to talk him out of saying that. Colin Powell did, Secretary of State Shultz did, his communications director Tom Griscom did, the American ambassador to West Germany did. And their argument to him was, look, that wall's not coming down anytime soon. You're starting to get along with Gorbachev. You've got the first deal to get rid of the European missiles. First modest deal was already done. And you're just going to antagonize him, because remember, Reagan personalized it in the active voice. He said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. He made, you know, personalized it to him. He could have put it in the passive voice and left Gorbachev. He didn't do that. And they kept telling him to take it out of the speech, and he said no. He would keep getting new drafts of the speech from the State Department with the line taken out, and he put it back in. And they're in the limousine in Berlin, driving to the wall, and his chief of staff, Ken Duberstein, at that point, I think his deputy, he later became Ken Duberstein, took one last run at him, saying, you know, the National Security Council and the State Department all think you should take that line out. And Reagan finally says, remind me of something here. I'm the president, right? Yes, sir. Then the line stays in, right? Same thing happened with the Strategic Defense, the Star Wars speech of '83. He was almost alone on that, all by himself, which gives the lie to the old commonplace view that he was a creature of his staff, right? That's not really true. So he gives that speech and, you know, upsets everybody. The New York Times was unimpressed. And then Gorbachev, it's not quite right to say returns the favor, but in December of 1998, Gorbachev comes to the UN to give his annual UN speech, like heads of state often do if they want to. And he also says, I want to meet with you, he says a note to President Reagan, I'd like to meet you one more time. They'd met at this point 4 times. And the election, though, had taken place. George H.W. Bush was president-elect. And Reagan said, I'll be happy to see you in New York, but we don't really want to have a full-blown summit. We're in a transition period now. I want to bring President-elect Bush with me, of course, and so let's not really do any business, but I'm happy to sort of see where things stand. I said, okay, fine. No surprises like the Iceland summit in '86. And Gorbachev gets up, and the documents on this are fascinating. He told his aides, I want to give the anti-Fulton speech at the UN. And what he meant by that was, it turns out Gorbachev had read some of Churchill's works. He'd read The Gathering Storm and several other of Churchill's works, and he'd read the Iron Curtain speech which Churchill gave in Fulton, Missouri, a speech in 1946, right, where Churchill introduced that phrase, the Iron Curtain is descending across Europe. But that's also the speech where Churchill laid out the argument that the Second World War should be thought of as the unnecessary war, because it could have been prevented, the phrase he used, without the firing of a single shot, if only we had armed ourselves sufficiently and stood up to the dictators diplomatically. That became the Cold War story of containment. We're going to arm ourselves sufficiently and stand up to the Soviet Union diplomatically. And that was really done with clarity under Reagan, I think. We had kind of gotten fuzzy from the mid-'60s on. And so here's Gorbachev saying, I want to give the anti-Fulton speech. In other words, he's saying, I want to declare the Cold War is over. And he did more, though, than just declare that I want the Cold War to be over. We had been for 20 years in talks with the Soviet Union in Vienna to reduce conventional weapons and conventional forces in Europe. Because, you know, we had, I don't know, but NATO had 400,000 or 500,000 troops, and we have all those troops in Germany and Italy and elsewhere. The Soviet Union had all those troops in Czechoslovakia and Poland and elsewhere. And we'd gotten nowhere with those negotiations. And Gorbachev shows up and says, I'm announcing today that we are withdrawing all of our armies from Eastern Europe. Just doing it without, you know, don't need to reach a treaty, we're just going to do it. And he said also in that speech that the way he put it privately to the countries of Eastern Europe is, you're on your own. If you're into trouble, we're not sending in tanks to bail you out. We're out of that business now. So, you know, the East Germans begged him the night the Berlin Wall was collapsing, and he hung up on them. So he generally was a different kind of guy. And in fact, I think this is what James Wilson argues in this book and others, is that if the Politburo had any clue that Gorbachev really was going to be a liberal reformer, they never would have picked him to be General Secretary. And so it didn't really end formally until, you know, the Berlin Wall comes down and then the Soviet Union breaks up a couple years later. But that was the moment there, I think, on the sort of Gorbachev side of it, of him saying, I'm going to declare the Cold War over. And I probably should have, well, maybe I'll pull up during questions. There's a great picture I'd like to show sometimes of Reagan beginning his campaign in 1980. Some of you may remember seeing this. And he gave his speech on Labor Day, that traditional day you start your campaigns, across the Hudson River there in New Jersey, Jersey City, I guess, and with the Statue of Liberty in the background. And then one of the last pictures you'll see was him and Gorbachev on Governor's Island looking out at the Statue of Liberty together, which I thought is a nice little visual bookends for his presidency on the foreign policy side anyway. I'll stop there. I could go on forever about this, but I want to leave some time for questions and things, if people have them.